Hi, my name is Nick Collins. I got my BA from Wesleyan in 1976 and actually returned and after a year's absence and got an MA in music in 1979.
And I am David Harmon, also class of 76. I was a music and physics major, went on to be a physicist, but then threw that away and got into neuroscience instead, which is what I'm doing now. Nick, nice to see you. I was curious. I was a science kid and read science books and played with machines and toys when I was a kid. What did you play with when you were a kid that maybe led into your fascination with using electronics and music?
I probably played with exactly the same things that you did, but perhaps I was more misguided than you were in terms of the ultimate application of these things. You know, I grew up in an academic family, and my parents were both art historians and architectural historians. So I grew up in deeply immersed in the sort of New York art world. My parents took me to galleries and museums by way of daycare, and there certainly wasn't a very strong music presence in our family. In fact, my father was raised in Newton Highlands, near where you live, I think, and my mother was raised in Chile in South America. So many, many miles separating them. Both were told as children, whatever you do, don't ask for piano lessons because nobody in our bloodline has ever been musical. And I am the Mendelian product of that genetic merge, you know, sort of too doomed to failure. So the music, my music interest, aside from the pop music interest, really came out relatively late in life. Mm-hmm. And I think that you know, we came into Wesleyan in the sort of the twilight of the great liberal arts experiment. You know, that business of sort of taking courses all across the curriculum, specifically because there were no distribution requirements, was very much a part of our possibly impractical education. And so I think it provided a mashup of those childhood interests in erector set and making Rube Goldberg style machines to smash peanuts, and art and music via the rather eccentric music offerings of the music department. I don't know that it could have happened many other places. And God, it sounds like an ad for Wesleyan. I didn't mean it.
Was it a revelation to find out just what was going on with electronics and music at Wesleyan, or had you dabbled in that before?
I actually had, and I'd started getting sort of more seriously involved in music when I was in high school and gravitated towards electronic work at a time. I mean, remember, this is late 60s, early 70s. There was very little technology available for the average person to acquire, you know, synthesizers and that sort of stuff.
Oh, there are radio kits and things.
Yeah. As I recall, I was never very successful at soldering together radio kits, but that's a whole other story. But I think I got interested in electronic music more for its sort of contrarian quality at that time. It was a way to differentiate myself from the herd, you know, of everyone else who wanted to play electric guitar. And at least I knew I couldn't. Right?
Yeah. So
what?
Yeah. Go on.
No, I was just going to say that you work with John Barlow a lot. Yeah. And John Barlow was, through some miracle or the brilliance of random method, assigned to me as my freshman advisor. Wow. And, you know, I went into his office, you know, probably second, third day of freshman orientation week, you know, and I'm talking, I'm like, you know, I'm just like a little jerk from New York. And I say, I could do this, I could do this, I could do this, you know, Latin American studies, English literature. You know, and I talked a little bit about music, and I said, I've been doing some electronic music. And he said, oh, do you know Alvin Lucier? He makes music with bats. And I thought, wow, you know, I don't know if he's talking about the animal or the Louisville Slugger, but that is so far beyond anything I've heard of. And I thought, as a little snotty New York kid, I'd heard of everything. And so, you know, that was either the glue or the oil to make that kind of connection work. You know, Alvin had this beautifully deceptive property of mixing technology and what we might loosely call music. And it served as a real model for me going forward, which is within the guise of that very, very sort of contemporary post-Sputnik idea about technology, good, future, you know, there was that poetics, right, in what he did. In other words, wrapped up in these pieces wasn't a scientific experiment, was this beautiful poetic quality of a cultural object that could just as easily have been done with a viola da gamba. You know what I mean?
Was there something special about playing with those kind of, well, let's call them instruments or bits of, you know, electronics, and also just invoking the electromagnetic spectrum, you know, electromagnetic fields and electricity directly to make the sounds and effects you wanted to play instead of just your body directly?
Right. I mean, I think that when my son was just under 2 years old, we left New York and we moved to Amsterdam. I took a job there and we didn't come back for a decade. And raising my kid there, he was a shy kid. He was the first kid. And he wasn't socially very fluid. And my father-in-law said, the next time he's with a bunch of other kids, just throw a soccer ball into the middle and they'll work it out. And he said that, you know, the soccer ball, he was a big sports guy, is like a social facilitator. You know, it kind of like made things happen, right? I think for our generation, which grew up, as I say, immersed in this idea of technology as this sort of wonderful gift, and it's our key to the future. There's something about the idea that certain technology puts you in contact with something outside yourself, right? And you know what's so beautiful about it, if you look at, like, say, the history of physics in the 20th century, is you move further and further away from the directly observable, and you move more and more into things that have to be perceived either through, you know, very exotic mechanisms or through a Gedanken experiment, you know, a thought experiment. And I think that's something that cuts across a lot of disciplines for, as I say, for people of our generation. I think that that's something that keeps floating around.
So that kind of abstract world that your head is in while you're doing these physical world things.
So, for example, you ended up in quantum originally. And quantum, well, in addition to just being like spooky, quantum's very non-tactile compared to certain aspects of physics, as I understand it. I mean, moving from classical mechanics to quantum is really, you know, like that's a big deal. And I'm wondering, how did you relate to your childhood approach to mechanics, right, and science, and the area that you ended up focusing in that first phase of your sort of adult science career?
Yeah, what they seem to have in common is you're always making models in your head of how you think things work. So even if it's a simple machine, you have an idea about the rules that govern what it does, and maybe you can even touch those rules with your hand. When you switch over to studying something like quantum theory or different kinds of astrophysics and spend space-time, you just have a different model in your head, even though you still believe it's true. So that much it's similar, but then you have to learn the new language and the new idioms and change the rules in your mind and then live in that, but you're still believing in things that are really happening based on a simplification in your head. So that much is the same, and that's true pretty much for any science and maybe any endeavor with that kind of abstraction involved. I mean, it has to be right. I mean, if it doesn't work, then if it's not true, then it doesn't work.
What happens for you when you reach that point of the mental model breaking down, that is, not being able to fully model something to the point that you can understand it, Right.
Yeah, usually just, feel dumb for a while. um, and, you wonder, well, you're trained to be skeptical as a scientist. You really don't believe anything, and you always try to remember to question your assumptions. That's where your imagination has to come in, and you have to
Yeah.
imagine new alternatives, either variations or just be crazy, and try things that seem nuts before. Usually that doesn't work, but if it does, then you get somewhere.
I knew a mathematician when we were living in Berlin. His daughter went to school with my kids, and he was talking at some point about and the topic of a version one area of mathematics that dealt with multidimensional structures came up, and I said, "Well, can you tell me if you work with these guys, do they visualize in more than 3 or 4 dimensions?" And like a lot of mathematicians, he was very serious, and he thought for a moment, and he said, I know 2 guys who can visualize in 5 and sometimes 6 dimensions, but beyond that, it's all metaphorical. And I thought, what a beautiful admission, because it is true. I think you reach these threshold points. And my son works in AI, and he's working for the company that did the AlphaGo project. And I was with him and a friend of ours who's quite a good Go player in Amsterdam at one point. And I was talking with them about whether if you have AI developing game strategies for a game as complicated as Go, if it will suddenly create a situation, if it will eventually create a situation where human beings realize that they have a kind of a limit to how far they can conceptualize or strategize. It's not like how fast you can run or how high you can jump, but the idea that at a certain point you're going to be playing an AI machine in a game and you will not be able to understand that strategy. It's not a strategy that you could get to.
Well, and a lot of those AI things and neural networks, they don't really have a definable strategy. They just come up with patterns of patterns, and you can't really explain it. Or at least maybe that's what you're saying.
No, and this is exactly what we ended up talking about, because, I think you're a programmer, I do programming, and, I've worked since the 70s with the notion of algorithms, these sort of neat, compact expressions that generate a kind of a plenitude. And the notion that the AI systems are not algorithmically based came as really a slap in the face to me. And, my son has talked to me about the work being done in, as it were, the analysis of AI solutions, right? And I find that quite fascinating because, as you say, it may not turn out to be a question of strategy in the way we think about it, which kind of, that's a dead end to a conversation right there.
I think that's what you kind of do, though, if I might say, when one composes a piece of music or any work of art, you start out usually simply, and then you step away from that and develop some kind of complexity that maybe is interesting or beautiful or just unusual. And then you get to a point where I suppose the listener wouldn't understand it based on what they're used to. It's a surprise.
Yeah.
Or it's just new. And then you give them a little chance to develop their own understanding and rules, and then you come back home.
Yeah.
Would you say that's a fair representation? You move to complexity and then back to simplicity.
Wow. Yeah. And here you're looking at a guy who was educated in music in the heyday of minimalism and conceptualism. And, I left Wesleyan thinking, as long as I just keep making things simpler, everything will be better. Sadly, it didn't work that way. Like at a certain point, as I say, I talked about Lucier's poetics, that you have to leave a crack for that sort of stuff to come in. And I think that, we're still dealing with the sort of backwash of conceptual art. And I think that one has to, as it were, always protect oneself against the idea of over-rationalizing in certain domains. In other words, I think in some domains, it's not possible to over-rationalize. But I think that in music for sure, and I think it probably works in other so-called creative arts, is you need to find a way to do that. You know, you need to find a way to do that. As I explained it once to somebody in a language I didn't speak very well, you know, when you're building a boat, you use a scaffold. But at the end of the day, no matter how great your scaffold is, you got to be able to take it off and let the boat float. And I often think of those painful moments in concerts where I've actually launched a piece and I'm looking, you know, out at the audience and I'm up there on stage doing this thing. And I'm thinking, well, am I floating or am I sinking? You know? It was a nice scaffold, you know, but.
Does the audience help being a scaffold in those situations?
It depends very much on where you are. You know, I remember living in the Netherlands. I was running a foundation that did music work. I had access to a lot of funding for doing projects, and I was producing these various festivals and stuff. And I was spending, I'm sorry to admit, a ridiculous amount of money on these projects that, you know, like 10 people would come to, and they'd all look grouchy in the audience. And part of this was just, part of this is the Dutch. I mean, I'm sorry, Dutch people out there. Part of it was just a certain taciturn quality of the Dutch. But a friend of mine who was very high up in the culture ministry said, Nick, you're an American. You have to understand how we work. You know, we have a tax system. We pay a lot of taxes, and a lot of that goes into culture. And the attitude of the Dutch is, we will support culture, but don't expect us to enjoy it. Okay, got it. You know, now at least I know what I'm up against. Yeah. So those are the people who aren't going to help you float the boat, you know. So
yeah, so that made me think of performances, whether you're floating or sinking. In several of your pieces, it looks like you have a heads-up display on a screen of a close-up of the performers doing something you might not normally see performers do, like using their hands in a circuit or somehow collaborating, but you're allowing people to watch the performers in a new way. Yeah. So you think is it usually important to somehow see the performers, at least to know, to make some kind of contact with what they're doing and not only with what you're hearing?
The sort of history of electronic music in the 20th century, you know, it goes back primarily to something that comes out of film montage. And it was the idea of producing tapes, you know, that you could edit very carefully something. You know, it has one foot in film and one foot in serialism, where the idea was control. I came up in this sort of post-Cagean backwash, which it embraced a lot of aspects of chance and indeterminacy. And my particular niche was this notion of live electronic performance, that rather than play a piece that you'd worked on in the studio, you would create something on stage. In my particular case, and I can't speak for everyone else, but I was interested in the risk. I was interested in improvisation. I was interested in interaction either between a person and some piece of technology, or between people and technology on stage. But the upshot was that the dynamics of it was very much based on live performance. A recording was a very sort of flat thing. And later in life, when video became a more viable option, and I was teaching in an art school, so I was late in life, I started teaching, and I was much more immersed in visual content. I got more interested in using those sort of techniques just to bring the audience in closer. In some cases, it made certain decisions and sounds that happened in a piece seem as though they had more of a reason for being than if you didn't get that information. And I still have feelings that sometimes it's a bit of a cheap shot, but I think it's like elections in America. Nobody gets 90% of the vote. And I figure I'm lucky if I get 52. So I figure if I'm at 52% good, 48% nah, in terms of how I bring in these cheats, I'm okay.
But part of the, I guess, improvisational process is reacting to things that were unexpected or unanticipatable, you know, even if they're errors. Yeah. And then, you know, you go with that and you take it to a new place.
Yeah, and I think I used to make harder distinctions between musical forms that embrace improvisation and risk and those that don't. And now I see it as much more nuanced And I don't think there are any forms of performed music anymore that don't involve some degree of risk.
Mhm.
But it's a question of where your focus is in a work. And I think that some genres of music have sort of tried to focus the audience's attention on those ideas of risk, improvisation, interaction, where others kind of sublimated under other, I don't know, the composer or the creator may have higher priorities than that. I'm a very simple person. I tend to lay this stuff out on the table.
So when it's novel, like I'm assuming electronic is for most audiences, is there what kind of different reactions do you get in different cultures? Are some more accepting of that kind of play, or others going, this is just a little too weird?
Well, it's two separate things. In other words, there was a time possibly when electronic sound was unusual and unexpected. Now it's actually the norm. You know, in other words, when I came to teach in art school in '99, art school was, you know, to me it was about, you know, bands, everything from, you know, the Beatles to the Talking Heads. They came out of art schools. By the time I got into art schools, the only music coming out of art school was garage and acid house, and it was all being produced on computers. And the idea of playing together with someone else, it was like, why would I do that? But at the same, so, you know, the whole sound world of people since 2000 is immersed in electronic sound. On the other hand, there is still a situation where music like without a pulse, or music without harmony or melody or lyrics, you know, or obvious form, you know, these things tend to make people a little more nervous. So I think it has more to do, the acceptance of certain types of music has more to do with these sort of larger issues than it has to do with, is it a violin or is it an oscillator? Mm-hmm. And I also have noticed, and it's a little sad, it's like watching species disappear, that the world is getting much more similar in terms of people's expectations about music because of, I mean, I'm sorry to use a cliche, but because of the internet, we're spreading everywhere. And I'm reaching audiences that I never could have reached when I put out my first record in 1981. I mean, you know, who was going to get it in South Africa or Punta Arenas or, you know, Southern Thailand? It just wasn't.
The interesting stuff get lost with all this sort of precipitation. It's like acid rain mostly. It's very gentle. Yeah. Uninteresting and corrosive.
Yeah, it drove me crazy when I would be traveling in South America in the 80s, and everyone was listening to ABBA and Europop, and I was thinking, Jesus, don't you realize what you have here? You know, I'm in Colombia, for God's sake, and it's like you're listening to this. So, you know, but
have you ever heard of, slightly off track here, but in Holland, the Strand Beasts?
Oh, yeah.
By Theo Jansen.
In fact, and I have to tell you, we're going to have to wrap this thing up because we've been going for almost half an hour. Mm-hmm. The Strand Beast, we have a friend, Robert Poss, also Wesleyan, who had a wonderful band in New York.
Guitarist.
Band of Susans, which my wife, Susan Tallman, BA 79, was in. And he's worked for the last several years as a freelance sound engineer mostly for European networks working on features in the U.S., but he was actually involved in a Strand Beast documentary.
That's fun.
So, small world.
Yeah, thinking of.
I'm on Cape Cod right now, so maybe I'm kind of a Strand Beast, you know.
So as a novel form of locomotion or any other kind of movement.
Yeah.
Well, we have been doing this a while.
Is there
anything else we wanted to cover?
We spoke to the essence of what Wesleyan made of us, for better or for worse. For better or for worse.
People taking risks and trying goofy stuff.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, by way of closing, I got into education late in life because my father was a professor, and I said I'd rather do anything but this, and then I watched my children, you know, come up and apply to universities and colleges, and I've done a lot of workshops in a lot of places, mostly in this sort of handmade electronic music stuff, and I was really shocked when I did a workshop at Yale. Not a bad school. It's downriver from Middletown, for those of you who don't know. And, well, down 91, not down the river. And I was shocked at how unadventurous the kids were. You know, that before any kind of experimental process we would start, they would say, well, so what's the outcome going to be? And I realized that kids get into elite schools these days from being very, very careful, risk averse, you know, risk averse.
Right, thorough. But,
yeah, yeah. And I think that one of the wonderful things about, you know, our time at Wesleyan, it was a very risk embracing place. I mean, well, how else can you describe a school where like a kid who grows up in Scarsdale goes off to get 3 degrees in gamelan? I mean, what were you thinking, buddy? But it was like, that's so wonderful. And I just, you know, I don't see it around much anymore. I think maybe Wesleyan still has some of that, but we're sort of the last hurrah of idealistic veterans of a liberal arts education. And I think your career track and my lack of a career track speak to that.
It brings up lots of fond memories of John Barlow, where, you know, I'd wonder, wow, how did he ever think to look at things that way? I mean, it reminds me of Einstein and general relativity, where he does this amazing, you know, backflip into geometry.
Yeah, that's right.
From gravity, and then says, well, you know, if you look at the stars by the sun during an eclipse, the light will bend. Nobody ever thought to look at that before. He just says, go look over there and see what you see. And he was right. You know, how do you make that leap of imagination? It's just astonishing. And Barlow felt that way sometimes as a teacher.
Yeah, we got to leap